We will be in Matthew chapter 6 this morning, beginning in verse 19. And you see in the Sermon on the Mount here in chapter 6, Jesus, in the first half of this chapter, has talked about our inward devotion to Christ, what it means to follow Him through our desires. He's talked about things like our giving. He's talked about prayer. He's talked about generosity. And he talked about fasting. And now he's going to move from those things into these outward expressions of it, of what it means to follow Him, of what it means for Him to rule and reign in our life. And he transitions, it seems kind of abrupt, but he transitions from fasting to this notion of talking about greed and about our view of money. But it makes sense because fasting is all about self-denial, and greed is all about pleasing oneself. It's all about engorging on life. And in this country, in our society, there is a condition that is more corrosive and destructive than even Ebola. Sociologists have called it affluenza. It's the pursuit of more. It's this hunger that wells up inside of us to always have more money, more stuff, and to be willing to do whatever is necessary to gain it. There is no satisfaction in our culture. We constantly are wanting more. We're constantly wanting more stuff, bigger stuff, fancier stuff, better technology, not for the sake of need, but simply for the sake of status. But greed, this affluenza, it is damaging, it is destroying society. Time Magazine and The Atlantic, both earlier this year, published articles in which they said, the mantra of the 80s, greed is good. They said that there's this evolutionary link that society is bettered by greed. That as we strive for more, it makes society better. But that doesn't back up what researchers are telling us. Researchers are telling us that greed is actually destroying things. The Boston Globe wrote an article where they ask the simple question, does money change people? And they found that it does. They said that a lot of people who strive for wealth have a harder time connecting with others. They show less empathy and dehumanize those who are different. They're less charitable and generous. The University of California at Berkeley, they did a number of tests to see if money changes people. And in California, there's a law that anytime somebody is at a crosswalk, traffic has to slow down. And so what they would do is they would send out students from their research laboratory and they would have them wait at crosswalks, and they had somebody hiding who was cataloging. And what they found is those who drove the most expensive cars refused to stop more than 50% of the time. And those who had the less expensive cars never broke the law one time. They even said, let's see what money does in something as simple as a game of Monopoly. Right? Monopoly is a game about capitalism. And so they said, well, here's what we'll do. We'll rig a game of Monopoly, and we'll let people know that it's being rigged. They brought in 100 pairs of people, and they just flipped a coin. And one person got double the money of their opponent, and they got to roll 2 dice instead of 1, so that they were accumulating all kinds of money. It was rigged. And not only did they do that, they gave the person with more money, they gave them the fancy piece. Right? They gave them the Rolls Royce. And the person with less money, they got to pick if they wanted the shoe or the thimble, the 2 poor pieces. And what they found, they watched in 15 minutes of game time, those who had more money would taunt their opponents. As they moved their pieces around the board, they would do it with they said they described it as a loudness. They'd slap it on the board every time they moved it. And when they got done, they interviewed them, and the person who had more money, They talked about their strategy, and they took credit for their win. A win that was fixed from the beginning because they were given double the money and all these extra benefits. Yet they showed how this made this person arrogant. In the University of Minnesota, they brought in people and they began to talk to them, and they found that even the mere suggestion of getting more money makes people less friendly, less sensitive to others, and more likely to support statements like some groups of people are simply inferior to others. And so researchers are telling us that this notion of greed, this striving to get more, is dangerous. But it ought come as no surprise, because Jesus said the same thing 2,000 years ago. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, he begins to talk about what does it mean to have this utter devotion to God? What does it mean to have God so totally in control of your life that he even controls your bank account, your wallet, your pocketbook? Let's look at what Jesus says here in verse 19. Jesus says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body, so if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Jesus tells us that greed is destructive. And he tells us why. The first thing he tells us is that greed creates a corrupted heart. Jesus says that our passions, our ambitions, will naturally follow our treasure. Wherever your treasure is, there is where your heart will go. Jesus says, whatever it is that we treasure, that is, whatever we fill our hearts with beauty and value of. That's what it means to treasure something. Whatever fills our hearts with value, whatever we say in life is of greatest value, that is where our heart's going to go. That's where our ambitions will go. That is where we will direct our lives. Jesus says we need to be careful where we store our treasure, because our treasure is what we draw our significance from. Think about it. Those people who are in love with money, the reason they love money is because money, we feel, gives us significance. If I have money, I have control. If I have money, I have power. I can buy what I need. I can take care of myself. If I have money, there is no situation in which I feel I'm going to find myself where I'm in want. We feel like to have money provides stability and security, provides happiness, and so we like to think that money provides us significance in life. And we see a culture that pursues money because we think that the more money we have, the more worth we intrinsically have. Right? We feel good when we say that we got a promotion because we understand people realize that means more money comes with that, more power comes with that. We tie all of our worth and we tie all of our significance into our treasure. But Jesus offers a warning about that because he says, not all treasure lasts. We can store up treasures on this earth, but they will not last. Jesus says that some treasures suffer passive loss. He talks about rust. He talks about decay. Think about it. There are people who, over the last several years, they've put their money in the stock market, and some days it just didn't go well for them. Some days the stock market dropped. The stock that they had put money in, it dropped. And within a matter of minutes, within a matter of hours, their fortune dramatically changed. Sometimes money just disappears. I mean, it seems like we are always having to spend it with bills and things always breaking around houses and cars, and we lose money. We lose stuff. Sometimes it's active. There's people who steal it. There's people who take it away. Jesus' whole point is this, is if you are trying to find your greatest value in something on this earth, it ultimately will not last. You can't take it with you. All the stuff you have does not go with you. I mean, it's amazing. If you see, they've been doing all these excavations over in Egypt in King Tut's tomb, and the Egyptians believed that you were to put all of these treasures in the pyramids, in the tombs with these pharaohs, because so that they can enjoy them in the afterlife. Guess what? They didn't. All we've got now is a bunch of grave robbers who came along in the last 2 centuries and said, wow, look at what I got. You don't get to keep it. And this notion of every bit of worth, every bit of significance is here on this earth. Jesus says it's foolish because it won't last. If our treasure is earthly, then our heart will be too. If our treasure are the things of this earth, if it's stuff, if it's technology, if it's houses, if it's cars, if it's money, if it's power, Jesus says if that is where our treasure is here on earth, that is where our heart will be. But think about it. If our treasure is corroding, what does that mean about our heart? Our heart is too. If our treasure is in things that are not lasting, if our treasure is those things that are dissipating and disappearing, Jesus is saying our heart is going to be corroded and our heart is going to be corrupted just like our treasure will be. I mean, you watch and you see people all the time, and you see all these callous people who all they care about is making an extra couple of dollars. And they don't care who they hurt along the way. They don't care what it brings about. And a treasure that is corrupted and is corrupting produces a heart that is corrupted and corrupting. But Jesus offers an alternative. If our treasure is in heaven, our heart will be there too. If we, as Jesus says, lay up for ourselves, if we are making eternal investments, if we are daily depositing in the bank of the kingdom of God, Jesus says that's where our heart's going to be. We say, well, what does it mean to make these investments? Michael, what does it mean to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven? I think there are several things that come to mind. One is people treasures. When we invest our resources in people, part of the treasures we are laying up for ourselves are souls. I'll never forget going to Brazil several years ago. And we walked into this church, Nova Igreja Batista. And there's a plaque in the front of this church that has about 5,000 people meeting every Sunday in worship, with the charter members on the names on this plaque. And 2 of those names, Wallace York and Doris York, my grandparents. My grandparents moved down to Brazil in 1961. Pip said that when they went down there, they literally would take machetes with them to go to church on Sunday mornings because they would have to hack their way through jungle. Now as Manaus has grown out, Manaus has grown, here's a church that is changing a city for Christ. And people came up to me and said, your grandfather baptized me. Your grandfather led me to Christ when I was a little boy. There are people who, because of the investment of my grandparents, are coming to know Jesus. I can't imagine. My grandfather is now in heaven. I can't imagine some of those who are waiting for him, maybe that he had never met here on earth, who said, Wallace, thank you for your investment. Every Sunday when we give, part of the money that we give here at First Baptist Salem goes around the world. It goes to little house churches in China, in Cuba. It goes to missionaries who are in these Muslim countries in Northeast Africa, in the Middle East. And one of these days, I firmly believe we're going to meet people who are going to say, thank you for your investment. When we spend time with people in our community, we invest in them. We are storing up for ourselves treasures in heaven because we are making impact that does not end when Christ returns. We are making an eternal impact through the way we give, through the things that we do. You know, when we go to Moldova, as teeth are being cleaned, as children are being played with, we are making eternal investments here. Lives are being changed. Eternal destinies are being changed because of investments that this church makes with our resources and with our finances. We lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven through people treasures. We lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven through the rewards that come from good works. And the Bible speaks of God rewarding us for serving Him. The Bible speaks of God giving us these rewards, these gifts for our service that one day we can lay down at His feet. And as we serve God, as we take what He has given us and use it to bless others, God in His grace rewards us. I mean, do you ever think about that? God rewards us for doing what we ought to do anyway. Is that not the definition of grace? That God blesses us and God gives us these gifts for simply doing what we're supposed to be doing. But then there's heaven itself. We get to spend an eternity in the presence of God, perfect union with Him through His Son. I think this is one of the rewards. This is what it means to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven, is that as we live this life, we are always looking ahead. You know, they did a test several years ago. They would bring these kids in at Stanford University, and they would tell them, all right, here's a big, giant, fluffy marshmallow. We're going to set it down in front of you. And you can eat this marshmallow, or if you wait 15 minutes, if we come back and you haven't eaten the marshmallow, you get a whole bag of marshmallows. Now, you go, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal. That's sort of a no-brainer. But they're not asking adults. They're asking 6-year-old kids. I know what my son would choose. Matter of fact, I heard he took a bite of everybody's s'mores last night at a class party. But they found 30% of the kids, roughly 30% of the kids waited and said, you know, we'd rather have the whole bag of marshmallows than just devouring this one. And they stayed with those kids. They continued researching those kids, and they found those kids did better in school. They scored higher on standardized tests because they were able to say the temporary is not as important as long distance. And we as Christians need to understand that lesson. We too often trade eternity for now. I want to feel good now. I want significance now. I want my reward now. But God is offering us an eternity of blessing. God is offering us an eternity of reward and of satisfaction. How foolish of us to try and gain significance here and now by storing up for ourselves treasures that are decaying and rusting and will not last when God is offering us something permanent. Greed creates a corrupted heart, but greed also creates a clouded mind. Jesus says there in verse 22, the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. Think about it in this way. The eyes, in some ways, they're the windows of light for the body, aren't they? I mean, if your eyes are closed, you don't see anything. I remember when Sarah and I were dating, Sarah had a number of surgeries on her eye. She was having some bleeding behind her eye, so I had to go in and stick needles in her eye, and man, I was checked out for that. But there was a period where she could not see anything. She had to wear bandages over her eye, and I was her senile Michael. And just so you know, I behaved myself like 95% of the time. But it taught me, here she was totally dependent on me to get around. She was totally dependent on her parents to get around. She couldn't drive, she couldn't do anything, she couldn't see. We would sit and listen to the television, and if you can't see anything, there's no light getting in your body. So, but the Hebrews, the rabbis, the Old Testament speak of the eye in another way too. You see, in the Old Testament, a good eye is an eye that is focused, whereas a bad eye is an eye that wanders. Proverbs, a bad eye is described as an eye that wanders and is greedy. A good eye is focused on God. And so Jesus here, he employs that metaphor, and he says, if you have a good eye, this is how light, this is how grace, this is how goodness is getting into your life. If your eye is focused on God's will. But if your eye is wandering, if it's always looking at stuff, if it's always seeking how you can get more, if it's always just trying to find what brings you temporary pleasure, Jesus says your whole body is corrupted. Think about the way that the Old Testament treats the eye. The eye is the gateway of sin in the Old Testament, isn't it? Do you remember in Genesis chapter 3? You remember how Moses writes it? It says that Eve saw the fruit, and you remember what it says? It says it looked appealing. There in Genesis chapter 12, there's a famine in the land, and it says Abram looked to Egypt, and it looked appealing. Potiphar's wife looked at Joseph, and he looked appealing. You see this all throughout the book of Genesis. You see this all throughout the Old Testament. The eyes are the gateway for temptation. And we can be those who are constantly looking around in our world and saying, oh, I want that, I need that, that will make me happy, this will bring me satisfaction. Or as Jesus says, we can have a good, clear eye, an eye that is focused. See, greed has a way of clouding our eyes and our body. One of the first things they tell you when you learn how to drive is you will move towards what you fix your gaze on. And they tell you, look straight ahead, look at the road, look in the distance. Why? Because that's where your car's going to go. This is why texting is dangerous. This is why looking off and waving and talking can be dangerous, because if you're not focused on where you're headed, you begin to wonder. And the same thing is true with our lives. If we don't have our eyes fixed on where we are headed, our lives just meander, and we're constantly looking to get more and to gain more, and Jesus cautions against this. Think of how greed clouds our mind. The first thing I think it does is greed clouds our mind to the fact that we're greedy. Ask somebody if they're greedy. What do you think they're going to tell you? Well, no. We can't deny a lot of sins, but we can deny greed, because greed's a condition of the heart. And we don't feel like we're greedy. But greed will make somebody take a job simply because they make more money. They don't ask any questions. They just know they make more money. Greed causes us to excuse our materialism. Greed causes us to stop asking questions about how we make and how we spend money. Greed clouds our mind to the fact that we're greedy, but greed clouds our mind to our idea of happiness. Isn't it sad that so many people in this country equate wealth with happiness? Wealth doesn't bring happiness. You don't have to have money to be happy. Yet greed so clouds and obscures our mind that we think that the two things are equated. If I just had more money, if I just had more stuff, I would be happy. Can I just tell you, it doesn't work out that way? They've done researches and they've done studies. Just because somebody has more doesn't mean that they're necessarily happier. Greed clouds our vision of success. We determine success by bottom lines. We say, well, my child, I want them to be successful. What do we mean by that when we say that? We mean I want them to make a lot of money. I want them to have a nice house. I want them to have a nice car. I want them to have a big family. Right? We determine success numerically. And so we look at success by all these superficial things that don't really matter. And some people who have been obedient their whole life to what God has for them, they walk around hanging their head because our culture doesn't define them as successful. So they don't feel successful. But it's because we've perverted the idea of what success is. Greed clouds our mind to our opinion of others' worth. You don't hear people say, oh, so-and-so's in a lower economic bracket than I am. We look at people in lower economic brackets sometimes and we talk about them like they're less, they're not as worthy. Well, if they really cared, they'd work harder. If they really wanted more opportunities, they'd make them themselves. And we talk about people who may not have had the same opportunities. Maybe they have, but we sometimes tie people's worth to their bank accounts. Greed clouds our vision of God's will for our lives. One writer rewrote the 23rd Psalm for the American church, and he wrote it this way: "The Lord is my banker, my credit is good. He giveth me the key to his strong box. He restores my faith in riches. He guideth me in the paths of prosperity for his name's sake." You ever hear people question God's love, God's care, God's will for their life because things aren't going the way they want them to? I'm struggling to pay my bills. God must be mad at me. Things are tight financially. Maybe I'm not being obedient to God. It's because we have equated financial blessing, we've equated financial riches with God's pleasure. Guess what? That's nowhere in Scripture. Sometimes that Israel was at its richest was when God was most upset with them. When Israel had the most blessing, when they had the biggest bank account, when they had the least amount of problems, that's when their spiritual condition was at its worst and God's judgment was at its peak. We tend to think that God's will for us is for us just to be happy and rich, and our minds have clouded and that we've confused God's will with our own will for our own lives. And Jesus is saying we've got to have a right stance towards money. We've got to have our eyes focused on God's will for our lives. That's what has to drive us, not money, but God's will. Our eyes must be clear. Our eyes must be focused on what His plan for my life is. And that has to be what I strive for. Instead of being fixated on material things, I need to be fixated on God. Which is why He says there in verse 24, no one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. See, what is the answer for this? The answer is our lives must be lived for eternity and not for this world. When you set your ambition on something, you are not its master, it is your master. As Jesus says, you can't have two masters. Thomas Constable wrote a book called The Three Edwards. And in it he tells the story of a duke by the name of Reynold III. Reynold III was often referred to by a Latin name, Crassus, meaning fat, because he was such a large man. And his brother, Edward, took over. He arranged a coup and he took power from Reynold, and he built a room around Reynold. Now, Reynold was a very large man, and so what Edward did, so he wouldn't get ill will from people, he put his brother in this room, and he built a doorway that was narrow. No door on it, no bars on it, no guards at it. And all Reynold had to do in order to walk out of the room was to lose weight. But Edward knew his brother, and so every day Edward had the finest food in all of Belgium brought up. Cakes and chocolates and carbs galore. Right? All these rich foods. All Reynold had to do was say no thank you. But he kept eating himself, and instead of losing weight, he gained weight, and he couldn't get through the door. People would come to Edward and say, how dare you imprison your brother? And Edward could easily reply to them, all he has to do is walk out. And there in world is a picture of so many of us. That we are enslaved to our own desires and our own affections and our own passions. That we just constantly keep engorging on more of this world. And it has become our master. It's not that Satan has slowed us down. It's not that he keeps pulling one over on us. It's that we keep getting what we want. And we have the wrong master. See, Jesus says you can't serve two masters. He's not saying God and money can't coexist. But what he is saying is both can't be in the driver's seat. To put it in the language that Jesus uses here, you can have two employers, but a slave can only have one master. That's the word he uses. He uses the word slave here. And either you will be a slave to money, either you will be a slave to mammon, to stuff, to the things of this world, or you will be a slave for God. Jesus is saying we've all seen people whose lives are ruled by stuff, by the things of this world. Some people, they just save and save and save because they feel that money gives them this blanket of security. And they will squeeze blood out of a turnip. They will pinch pennies as tight as they can because they feel like that's the only way that they can have security. Some people go the other extreme and they just spend and spend and spend because the more they buy and the more stuff they have and the nicer stuff they have, the more significance they feel, the more impressed they think people will be with them. And their happiness fluctuates with their bank account. Money and stuff have become their master. But Jesus says we need to choose for God to be our master. We need to live lives that aren't about just serving Him here. It's not just about doing stuff now. It's not just about accumulating. Our lives are not just about temporary happiness. Our lives are about eternal impact. And we need to live lives that are constantly striving to invest in eternity. And I want us to think, what does it mean to live a life where God is master? I think first thing it means is we see money as a tool for life, not the object of life. None of us would deny money is good and money is helpful. You have to have money to pay bills. You have to have money to buy food. You have to have money to get clothes. Money is a good thing. But money is a tool. It is not the object of life. And we need to see money as a blessing God gives us so that we can bless others and so we can fulfill His purposes. The question I think you need to ask yourself is, do you use your money for God or do you use God to get money? A lot of Christians see God as nothing more than this cosmic banker, and the reason they serve Him and all the things they do for Him are so that they can get more. They think that by serving God, they get more blessings, and they view their bank account as a way to know how much God loves them. And we get mad at God when things don't go the way we want. But what we understand, if we realize money is a tool, we're saying God is going to give us what we need in order to do what He calls us to do. And so the money and the stuff God has given you is what you need for you to fulfill the plan He has for your life. If you need more, God will supply it to you. But what you have is what you need to serve Him with. And we need to ask ourselves, are we viewing money as the object of life? Are we viewing stuff as the purpose of our life? Or do we view our home, our car, our time, all these things as tools, as resources God gives us to bless others and to fulfill the commission He's given His church and Christians? The second thing I think we need to realize is that our obedience needs to show we care more about God than money. Do we sacrifice money to serve God, or will we sacrifice righteousness to serve money? It breaks my heart sometimes to see the things people do in reality for a few $100. People cheat on taxes just to have to pay a little less. I mean, is that really what you're saying your reputation and integrity is worth? People will feud and fight with family members, with friends. Relationships will end. Marriages will dissolve. Over what? Money? How ridiculous is that? And we will sacrifice righteousness. We will disobey God. We will do what we feel like doing just to save a couple of bucks. But if God is our master, whenever God calls us to be generous, we say, Lord, it's all yours to begin with. It's from you, it's for you. God, you gave this to me, and if you need to provide me more, I trust you'll do that. But God calls us to be generous, and we begin to panic. God gives us opportunities to give, and we begin to fret. God calls us to tithe, and we say, well, I can't afford it. And our obedience is not to God and His Word. Our obedience is to money. We base everything we do on it. Listen, the Bible is very clear. The Bible calls us to save money. The Bible calls us to invest money. But when it becomes what makes our decisions of how we're going to live our life, when money becomes the deciding factor in the things we do, in the decisions we make, in the priorities we have, we cannot dare say that God is Lord of our life. And that's finally number 3, God. To have a life where God is master means God is the primary factor in all our decision making. What are the questions that inform the financial decisions we make? I think for me, I think for a lot of people, the first question we ask is, can I afford it? Now, that's a good question to ask, but that does not need to be our first question. Our first question doesn't need to be, can I afford it? Our first question needs to be, how does this purchase, how does this investment honor God? Because there may be things you can afford, but you don't need them. But we need to ask ourselves with every purchase, we need to ask ourselves with every time we spend money, how does this go to honor God? How does this go to benefit Him? How does this go to bless somebody else? How does this go to do what He has called me to do? That needs to be the first question we're always asking ourselves when we spend money is, how can I use this for His kingdom? And then once we've answered that, then we begin to ask questions of, can I afford it? But if the first question we ask is, can I afford it? Who is making the decision, or what is making the decision? Money is. If you were to be dragged into a courtroom and accused of loving God, would your checkbook be called as a witness for or against you? This is a question we have to ask. Look at how we spend our money. What is it that we spend our money on? What is it we spend our time doing? What is it we use our stuff for? Does this go to emphasize, does this tell people this is a person who is sold out for Jesus Christ? This is a person for whom Christ is Lord of their life. This is somebody that wants to do everything they can to serve Him. Or if somebody looks at how we spend our day, if somebody looks at how we spend our money, if somebody looks at what our stuff is used for, would they say, this person was all about stuff? My favorite hymn of all time is Be Thou My Vision. It was written in the 6th century. It was translated by a lady named Eleanor Hull in the early part of the 20th century. She made it and versified. And that hymn sums up what we as Christians ought to strive for. It says, riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou, mine inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only be first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art. May God be our master. May God be our treasure. Let's bow our heads. Father, Lord, all money does for us is take from us. It takes our time and it takes our energy. And when we spend it, it's gone. But you are a master that gives graciously and for whom there is no depth which we can plumb of your love. There is no end to your grace. There is no end to your care. Father, I pray that money would not be the master that we serve. Rather, we would serve a master who has graciously given to us. Father, you gave us your Son. And we can have a relationship with you because of the gift that Jesus has offered in his death and in his resurrection. Father, as we put our faith in him, as he gives us his righteousness, and it is a free gift, it cost us nothing. That is a master worth serving. Father, may you show us how we fail to use our resources that you have given us for you. May you help us see the way we need to use our money and our time and our possessions for your kingdom. May the way we live our lives, may the way we spend our money, may the way we invest, may the way we save, may the way we display generosity show you are Lord of our life. May you be our master. And may we show that through the way we live. Father, I pray if there is anyone here, they've never put their faith in Jesus. Father, I pray that they would accept the gift of grace that you offer them, the love that you have shown them in Jesus Christ. Father, I pray that they would not live their lives for the things of this world, but would live their lives for you and make eternal investments for your kingdom. May that be our prayer. May that be our ambition. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.